Okay, we are recording now and I'll get started. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so many of you for coming. I really appreciate it. And this talk's gonna be a little different. At least I think it's different compared to other ones that I've seen. This is basically a philosophy based on being an employee rather than being a manager. That doesn't mean that the advice here doesn't fit if you do happen to be a manager, but my career is based on coming from it from a coming from the management employee relationship, more from the technical employee side, the person who is what I like to refer to as a working professional, and I'll define that a little bit later, rather than someone who wants to choose management as a career. I was not someone who wanted to, reach the C-level suite kind of thing in my career. Although I, of course, always dreamed about it, but really I cared more about the work I was doing than rising through the ranks in the organization. And therefore the advice and the situations I'm talking about are colored by that. The fact that you have to work with a manager all the time, and yet if your plan is not to move through the organization up to the top level, then what you want, what your incentives are, what your needs are different from what a line manager's incentives are, what their needs are, what they're looking for in their career. And this inevitably leads to conflict. And then what do we do about it? So that's more or less where this is coming from. The advice, your boss is not your friend, is something I will get to a little bit later. It's kind of a teaser just to get things started. So first of all, in the slides, which I'll make available somehow, I mean, if you send me an email, there's my email address. I will send them to you. I'm going to clean them up a little bit after our talk is finished, but I'll be happy to share a PDF with you at some point. Any rate, my name is Ken Cousin. It's cousin like the relative, even though it doesn't look like it. There's my email address, homepage, blog, Twitter handle, and I have a free weekly newsletter as well. It comes out on Sundays if you're interested. I've written those books in the past, none of which is directly related to the topic I'm talking about right now. I should mention that what I am talking about is part of an upcoming book that is going to be called Managing Your Manager from Pragmatic Programmers. I just couldn't quite get my act together enough for it to have an early release yet, but that'll be coming soon, very soon. All right, let's move on. Now, I mentioned that conflict with a manager is inevitable, and I want to define that because that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, the key is that because you and your manager really do want different things, then conflict is inevitable, but there may be the possibility of finding solutions that satisfy both sides, because what you're after isn't identical. If you both wanted exactly the same thing, then only one person can get it in some cases. But if you're actually after somewhat different goals, there are ways to build a relationship so that both sides succeed. And that's what I'm really after. So to start off, the question is, well, what do you want? And again, I'm talking about as a working professional. Now, of course, people talked about the idea as, oops, sorry about that. I didn't mean to skip a slide there. I thought I'd show the generic slide, the thing that comes from Wikipedia on good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the basic philosophy here is that you really can't start looking to satisfy needs higher on the hierarchy until the ones lower on the hierarchy have at least been addressed. If you don't have basic food, clothing, shelter, those sorts of things, then that dominates your thinking. And it's hard to think about, being fulfilled at your job if you have to still satisfy those. But hopefully, if you can make it through the first two or three of those, you can start looking at getting some of the rewards from your career, from your job, from your profession. So if you say, well, what do you want from your job? Again, the philosophers have been debating this sort of thing for centuries. I've always liked this particular quote, which is attributed to Aristotle, although again, like with anything that old, it's some debate as to whether he actually said it. But the idea is that happiness is the exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope. And the way I tend to interpret that is to say that what we want out of our career is enough autonomy to make decisions and to do what we need to do, to have the freedom to choose, in a job that lets you use your strengths, plays to what you do well, but still allows you room to learn and grow so that you can become better at what you do in a way that ultimately is going to give you rewards both from your peers and from the job as well. And if the job is successful at the same time, so much the better. Now, as I say, I use the term professional here. And what I mean by a professional are somebody who, well, I'd say a professional is someone who cares about their career and doing the job the right way, building results in a way you can be proud of that earns respect and rewards, arguably more than just making another dollar for the company. Now, I don't mean you don't care about whether the company succeeds or not, but a professional is particularly uncomfortable with sacrificing quality for expediency, even though if you're a professional with some experience, sometimes these things just have to happen. But really, when you list what they're really interested in, it's doing things the right way. And I also want to emphasize, by the way, that a professional doesn't mean that you have degrees or certifications or anything like that, especially in the IT world that I've spent much of my career in. I was a career changer. I came from the engineering world as well. In the IT world, I mean, I think we've all met just unbelievably fantastic developers who didn't have any real academic credentials to speak of. I mean, and I would consider them professionals by any measure. And of course, it doesn't have to be in IT. I mean, we have a guy who does work around the house who I consider an absolute professional, and he has very little in the way of academic credentials or anything like that. So a professional is someone who really works on their profession. They care about it. They want to do better. They take pride in what they're doing, and they value that as much or more than the financial aspects of it. Not that they don't care about the money, it's just that they also care about what they're doing. Now, then the question is, well, if that's what everybody wants, what does your manager want and how is that any different? I mean, don't they want exactly the same thing? And the answer, of course, is yes, but only if those things make money for the company. See, so much of the world is governed by incentives, as they say, by reward systems. Whenever there's a set of incentives or a way to get rewarded, people will find ways to try to maximize that reward. And for managers, in many cases, their job is fundamentally different from a professional's job. Now, a manager could be a professional as well. Heck, they could be a professional being a manager. Those are the sorts of people who do ultimately rise to the C-level suite. But the incentive as part of a manager's job that's different from a normal working professional is the idea of how they're evaluated. And of course, then they are evaluated, ties into their incentives. They are evaluated based on money. Now, when I mention the word money, I don't mean salary. I mean, we obviously all care about salary, benefits, all those sorts of things. It's more a question of caring about money for the company. This is something that managers are evaluated on. Help first, sell last. Right. Very good. Yeah, I like that. Um, yeah, I'll just go with that for the time being. So, at any rate, managers are often evaluated based on how the group that they're managing does in terms of contributing to the bottom line of the company or making projects completed on time and under budget. And I don't mean that they do that exclusively. In fact, most companies' managers are not just purely line managers. Most of them have some overlap, and especially the ones that technical people deal with all the time tend to be relatively low level managers who may have some project responsibilities or may have been so good at project work that they got promoted into management into a completely different job. That's a different problem. I'll come back to that one. The higher you go in a company, the more this issue of making money ties into the way they're evaluated. The more it influences their behavior and how they work. I have a friend who is a retired senior vice president of a Fortune 50 company. It's a giant company. He was vice president of one of the divisions in my area. I live in Connecticut, and we've been friends for many, many years. I never worked directly for him, so it was easy to be friends, rather than violating the first principle on the slide, your boss is not your friend. And he used to tell me that if a technical problem reached his level, if something was so bad in the company that he had to get involved, he would have a meeting with all his direct reports and the people in charge of that particular project. And the entire meeting boiled down to, what am I going to have to pay to get myself out of this? I mean, are we going to have to buy something? Is this going to be a fine? Is this going to mean we have to hire a bunch of people? Are we going to have to change the delivery schedule? It all came down to financial considerations. And then when the meeting was over, some of the engineers on this specific project would generally go up to him and say, do you want to know the actual technical details? Now, that company he came from tended to promote from within, and they were an engineering company. So he had an engineering background years ago. He always did want to know the details. But the point was that was a completely secondary consideration. The primary consideration overriding everything was about money. Now, I like to draw it this way, good old Venn diagram, is that you have an agenda for your job, for your career, and for your life. You know, what do you want? And your manager has an agenda for their job, their career, and their life. And by the way, just as an aside, I'm deliberately using the plural they when I'm referring to individuals. It's just much easier than saying he and she all the time. And that way I don't have to worry about it. I'm gambling, as many people are, that they will go the same way as you, Y-O-U, you winding up implying plural over the years. I'm going to use they for the same purpose. So at any rate, you have an agenda. Your manager has an agenda for their job, their career, their life, ultimately. And we try to operate in the overlap. I mean, if there's no overlap, why are we working together in the first place? Interesting. I had heard that. I'm just waiting to see if it becomes plural again, interestingly enough. But at any rate, we try to operate in the overlap, but of course, the others still happen. There are times when you want to learn a new technology and then carve off a piece of a project and do it on your own time, supposedly, and try to learn something. And then if it works, you go tell the group about it, minimizing all the challenges you had to go through to get it to work. And everybody's happy except your boss, who's wondering, wait a minute, did you really do that on your own time? And do we really want to introduce this new technology into the project without talking about it? And oh, great, now we've introduced a single point of failure. What if you leave? Or what if you just get full of business and you don't have any time to dedicate to this project? Or what if you decide you get bored and you want to try some other new technology? What are we going to do now? So then the manager decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bring in a junior person and have them work with you, and you can teach them what you know and how to work on this project. And then, of course, that sounds great from the manager's point of view. The problem is, from my point of view, if that happens to me, I'm like, my boss is asking me to train a lower cost replacement for me. It just doesn't feel like it goes into my agenda at all, even though, yeah, I want to do some technology transfer and make sure everybody knows this stuff. See, it's perfectly natural, normal behaviors on both sides that can lead to an inevitable conflict just because our interests don't completely overlap everywhere. Now, there's another complication, by the way. This comes up in the IT world all the time. And it's that in many cases, your manager is probably not very good at what they're doing. And there's a very logical reason for this. Now, if you are a manager yourself and you're relatively high up in the organization, this one may not apply. But for those of us who have stayed primarily technical, we're not in the management hierarchy, and therefore we're dealing with managers who are on the lowest rung of that hierarchy. Now, I'm making a distinction here between a manager, a line manager who wants to be a manager as a profession, and a tech lead. I mean, a tech lead, any one of us can be a tech lead or may have been in the past. Their priorities and incentives are very close to our priorities and incentives. They just have more work to do than we do in many cases. You don't need a lot of advice on how to deal with those people because we all want the same thing. But for line managers, we're often dealing with the people with the least experience at management, and they're the least proficient at it as well. Now, maybe they're the least proficient at it because they're new at it. Maybe they're people who never were going to be any good, and therefore they wound up being a low-level manager that's handling some technical people. Either way, we wind up getting an opinion of management that's very negative because we're dealing with people who aren't the experts. If you ever do get a really good manager, well, enjoy it, because really good managers are always looking for the next opportunity, the next level up, the next chance to work with a bigger group and bigger responsibility and more things, so that they don't tend to stay in one place very long. The other problem is, as you know, working in any business environment, you have to act like you know what you're doing. It's very hard to get people to listen to you or to respect your opinions once they start to doubt your expertise. And this is a real challenge. Now, there may be other challenges people have to overcome. I mean, if you're a woman or an underrepresented minority, you also have those hurdles that you have to deal with on a daily basis. I at least have the advantage of walking into this room as an older white male and will probably be taken seriously from the beginning, but a lot of other people have to deal with that problem as well. But it's true that everybody needs to project an air of confidence, and this is even true about those managers. In fact, it may be more important for them because their whole job is persuading people to do what they tell them to do. And if you're a technical person and your non-technical manager is telling you what to do, it's hard not to question that. But questioning that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of the manager. I mean, managers, employees, professionals advise, we provide information, and managers decide based on many things beyond what we care about, things having to do with political considerations or financial considerations or simply growth of other employees in the company. There could be a whole wide range of things in there. But the point is, a manager has to act like they know what they're doing, even when they know they're not technically as good as their own employees. I mean, how long do you have to be out of the technical ranks before you start feeling like you can't go back? It's scary. Just being a technical person, just keeping up in general is hard. Also, they generally know they're not great at this, especially if they're rookies, especially if they just got promoted into this or they're young and just got hired into that. It's a real problem. Now, I'm leaving out the good old Dunning-Kruger effect, as they say, the ones who believe they're phenomenal despite all evidence to the contrary. But we'll get back to that a little bit later. So if your manager isn't that great, what can we do about it? Now, I'm going to suggest that the issue is to build a relationship, a long-term relationship with your manager that results in both sides getting what they want. Now, this is going to be a bit of a challenge, but let's talk about the foundation. The term trust gets bandied about a lot, and I have to be careful because trust is a very emotionally laden word. So what do I mean by trust? Well, we trust our managers to do certain things for us. Like we trust them to fight the organizational battles we don't want to fight. We just want to work. We just want to get the job done. And this is true even if you're a manager, you trust your boss to fight higher level organizational battles on your behalf that you would not be listened to, where you would not be taken seriously. We also trust them to look out for our best interests, that they will try to get us what we want. They will try to protect our careers and grow them and help out. We also trust that they will defend us when problems arise. I've had managers who were really good at that. I've had managers who were, when problem arose, I felt like they were a magnifying glass and I was a little ant on the sidewalk. It was not pretty. But generally, we want them to defend us when there's an issue. We also trust them to do somewhat other similar things like get us the resources we need to do the job, whether it be time on a cloud computing platform or a new piece of software that we think is worth it, or just new computers when necessary, or things totally unrelated to IT. I'm just using a lot of IT examples, but we trust them to get us the resources we need. So all of this basically supports us in our career. We trust them to do that. I mean, we have to. That's their job, and that's what we need. Now, on their side, what do they trust us to do? Well, number one, of course, is they trust us to do our jobs to the best of our ability. That you will do your best, work as hard as you can, try to accomplish whatever tasks have been assigned to you. Now, that doesn't mean everything's going to go perfectly the first time. And when it doesn't, they actually trust us to let them know when there's a problem, especially early enough that they can replan, that they can adjust to it. So they can be, dare I say it, agile and adjust what they need to do and what they're doing on it. They also trust us to support them, especially publicly, to have their back as they were, as it were. It's a really important thing for managers because again, they need the support of us in order for them to accomplish what they need to do. Now, I collectively take all of those things and put them under the category of loyalty. Loyalty also is a loaded word, but I like to think of all those trust issues together as loyal. But I don't want to just be loyal. I want to build a relationship that uses what I like to refer to as constructive loyalty. See, constructive loyalty is loyalty where you are still getting what you want. It's not just given for nothing. This is a real relationship that goes both directions. We support them, they look out for what we want. And the wild card here is that this does not happen if you simply do everything they tell you to do. Now, that's a problem because if you ask the organization what to do in any conflict between a manager and employee, it's very likely that the manager's priorities overlap the company's priorities much better than the technical professionals' priorities do. I mean, the manager moves up in the ranks because their priorities align with the company's. It's just part of the process. And therefore, if you get into a conflict with a boss, usually the default solution from the company is do what the boss tells you to do. And I'm not going to say, I mean, the problem with that is if you do that, there's no incentive for the boss to give you what you want or to take your interests and desires into account. And this is a problem. Now, I'm also not going to tell you to not do what they tell you. I mean, obviously, I don't want you to get fired. I mean, you still have to accommodate what's going on. But I want to talk about a mechanism where we can train them to take care of what we're doing. And yes, communication is absolutely critical. That's absolutely right. That's a key in a lot of this. The problem a lot of us face is that most people feel when they get into a conflict with their boss, they only have two choices. They can either just swallow their pride and do what they were told, or they leave. And those are both extreme positions. Those are both a problem. If you just go along and you go home and you complain to your spouse or partner or talk to the dog or whatever, you're going to feel really bad. I mean, you didn't stand up for yourself. You're not getting what you agree with, what you think is right. You feel you're being taken advantage of. It's hard. It starts to undercut your confidence. On the other hand, leaving is a big decision. That's not a trivial thing. You don't want to do that as a first resort. That's a last resort. So the question is, what can we do as an alternative? And I'll give you one, but it's a long-term thing and it doesn't always work either. But it's better than either doing nothing or leaving right away. That's going to be my argument in this. And you're free to disagree and let me know that. Okay, we'll start off by this statement. There are really only two messages that you want to continually give to your boss. And these are subtle things that should color every interaction you have with your manager. What are the two messages you want to communicate to your boss? One I like to call, I got this. And the other is, I got your back. Okay, now that's very colloquially expressed. I mean, they're the very basic way of saying that, but those two messages are goals. Those are priorities that you want to keep in mind whenever you interact with your boss. Now, the phrase "I got this" does not mean to imply you can do everything about the job. When your boss gives you a task to do, you could say, okay, I got this. That doesn't mean you know how to do everything. It's very rare. In fact, usually if you can do every step of the project, they don't need a professional. They could give that to anybody. Anybody could do that. The reason they need a professional is because it's going to be hard and there's going to be problems. So you're going to have to work through them. What it means is you take responsibility for the job, meaning you'll do the best you can and you'll figure out what you don't know and how to go fill in the gaps, and you'll ask for help when you need it. See, it's the difference between saying, look, I don't ever want to do laundry. So if my wife asks me to do laundry, I'm going to ask for detailed instructions. I'm going to mess it up anyway, because after all, I didn't want to do it. See, that's not taking responsibility. That's just an employee, and that's a problem. I've been married a long time. I'm past that one. Okay. But it's taking responsibility is what you want. The I got this. That's what it means. On the other side, the I got your back doesn't mean you never argue with the boss. Of course you argue with the boss, and every relationship has its own comfort level with disagreements, as to how much disagreement you're comfortable expressing and getting back, especially when there's a power disparity like there is at work. That could be a little bit more stressful. But regardless of how much you argue with a boss, to the outside world, we're a team. I got your back. Everything will be fine. If this project fails or goes over or is a difficult problem, then the word that I will use all the time is we. We had a meeting and decided to do X, Y, or Z, and it didn't work. So then we met and replanned. This is the sort of message you want to communicate. And I include your boss's boss in that outside world part. As far as your boss is concerned, I got your back. That's the message you want to communicate. Those two messages go a long way toward making you a person that your boss wants to keep around, that they want to rely on and they want to keep happy, which is part of the goal here. You want them to value your contributions and care about what you want, and therefore take it into consideration when they're making decisions. It also means I'll back you up whenever necessary. And again, I use the word loyal on that. Now, in case you've never seen it, by the way, there's a fantastic movie that back in the 50s. It's called The Cane Mutiny. I highly recommend it. I don't know if anybody's seen it. Ken, you have to have seen it, right?
When I was a really small kid.
It's worth a rewatch. It's phenomenal. Now, I'm going to spoil part of it, but I watch it every time it comes on. I've seen it, I don't even know how many times. It's a Humphrey Bogart movie. He's here in the middle, but this is not the Humphrey Bogart from Casablanca. This is an insecure commander. He is worried and nervous and uncertain, sure of himself, and even kind of afraid of conflict and everything. And he winds up doing petty things and eventually loses the crew. The crew makes up songs about him, and they only go through the motions. It's a real disaster until eventually the carrier group winds up in a typhoon, and it's a mess. And Bogart freezes. He can't make a decision, can't adjust the ship, and it's in imminent danger of foundering, as they say. Colorized war film, yeah. Yeah, well, at any rate, this is a great movie, and I've seen it both in black and white and colorized, but I think it was made in color originally. It was early, but it is in color, even though the colors are not all that vibrant. Any rate, the problem is during the typhoon, it's too late to build the relationship. The mutiny part of the Cane Mutiny is the executive officer takes over. There's a court martial afterwards. They put Bogart on the stand. He starts, yeah, thank you. There's the link for that. They put all kinds of pressure on him, even though he's not the one on trial. And then he starts ranting and raving and being paranoid. And the line officers who are judging the court martial see what they had to deal with, and everything's fine. The problem is, here's where it gets interesting, is at the very end of the movie, the officers of the cane are in happy celebration because they're released, everything's fine. And here comes the defense attorney, and he's drunk and he's angry. And he says, a great bunch of officers you are. If you had given Captain Queeg, Humphrey Bogart, the loyalty he needed, do you suppose the whole issue would have come up during the typhoon? You see, by then it was too late. Anything you do during a reorganization where you want to decide what group you want to be in, or venture capital comes into the company and you want a piece of a new big project, or anything during our version of a crisis, anything you do during those times, it looks self-serving. It's not convincing. It doesn't help build the relationship. So you need to build the relationship beforehand so that when the crisis happens, whatever it may be in our organization, then the relationship is in place already. Now, there are things you can do to make that better. For example, one of a person's job, even though in IT, again, we rebel against this, part of your job is to make your manager look good to their manager. Violate this at your peril. Very important to make it clear to the boss's boss that we're a team and the manager was part of it. And if this worked out, well, that person gets some credit too, all these things. But I'll leave that at the moment. Let's move on to something else. Now, here is what I like to call a quick win. This is something you could try like tomorrow and starts building the relationship very quickly. Everybody loves somebody who is responsive, and your manager most of all. I mean, if you're stuck at home trying to accomplish something, in our remote world right now, and you don't know how to do it, maybe it's a technical problem and you're just not sure what the commands are. Say you're working with Git or something like that. And I know the parts of Git I use all the time, but if I have to fix something, I'm in trouble. Well, I've got somebody I can contact. So I send a message to them and say, how do I do this? And I wait and I wait and I wait, and I'm getting madder and madder because I'm stuck. I can't do anything. And then eventually I see that person on a Zoom call and say, how come you haven't responded to my email? And say, well, I've got 6,000 unread emails. Yeah, I don't care. Why didn't you respond to mine? Now you may not say that, but you're probably feeling it. And imagine how much worse that is coming from your boss. Your boss is like, I asked my direct reports a question. They didn't respond. Now, the reason you probably didn't respond is because it was an open-ended question with no easy answer that you don't really know the answer to. So what are you going to do? Well, in fact, there is a way to respond to requests very quickly that adds all the caveats you need, and this will save you all kinds of trouble. Here's a bit of a template. Let me say, generally, I'm referring to this in email, but it could be anything. You put it this way. You start off with, I don't know. I mean, say, let's pick a random, what would be a question these days? How is the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning going to influence our product in the future? I mean, something like that. It's clearly your boss heard some buzzwords. Maybe they were in a meeting. Maybe they got approached by a vendor. Maybe a competitor is using this and they want to find out what you know. I mean, when I get a question like that, I'm like, I don't know. But here's how you answer it. You go, I don't know, but here's what I do know. And you lay out all the things that you've heard that you think is actually correct about this stuff. You certainly know something just being in the field. Here's what I think. You lay down what you believe would be the next steps and how it might actually implement or affect things in the future. Here's where I would go to find out. See, in this mechanism, you are giving the boss a very rough estimate of the costs that it would take to actually find out the answer. And then you ask the magic question, do you want me to look into it? You see, employees, professionals advise, managers decide. Let them decide whether it's worth it for you to take all the time necessary, putting your existing projects on hold to give them a thorough answer to the question. And I promise you, 90% of the time or more, the boss is going to go, yeah, that's all I need. I was just trying to check. I just had an idea. I just wanted to verify, or they're bouncing it off other people as well. And the best part of this is you could churn out something like that relatively quickly without having a serious disruption to your day. Then you've been responsive, you've gotten the question out for your desk, you can get back to work, you build up the relationship at the same time. It's all good. Now, every once in a while, they'll come back with, yeah, I want you to take the time. Well, okay, at least then, if your projects are going to be affected time-wise, because you have to do something else, at least your manager told you to do it and they're involved. They're part of the decision-making progress, rather than you arbitrarily going, I don't know the answer to this, so I'm going to take 3 days to work it out, that sort of thing. Okay, the corollary here is a good enough answer today is way, way better than a great answer next week. I wish I had learned that way earlier than I did, because in school, we're taught the opposite. In school, a teacher asks a question, there is a right answer, and they want to hear it, and they want to hear how you got it, show your work and all of that. So there are huge costs for getting it wrong. At work, when someone asks a question, they're stuck. They just want to know what to do. And if your answer is, well, I don't really know, but here's some input you didn't have, here's some ideas, this is what I think is happening. You say, should I go dig into it? And they'll probably just go, yeah, that's fine. That's what I needed. And they can suddenly make progress again. It's really hard to get this because we're all perfectionists at heart in our profession and we hate being wrong, but you're adding in all those caveats to make it clear that you don't have a definitive answer right now. Okay, back to the I got your back part. To the outside world, we're a team. Now, that means that in effect, if you're in a hierarchical organization, and there are non-hierarchical ones, but most of them are, Most of them have a hierarchy. You don't want to go around your manager to talk to the boss's boss unless you are in an emergency, unless you feel ethically, morally compelled to be a whistleblower. This goes to the heart of the loyalty relationship. It's always very high risk and remarkably low reward, and there are always consequences. See, as a technical professional, if my boss tells me to do something other than what I suggested, and I feel they're wrong, there's this enormous temptation to appeal to a higher authority, to go to the boss's boss and say, look, this is a mistake. This is going to cost us money. It's not going to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Don't do it that way. Go to your boss. Say to your boss, look, I don't agree. I'd like to talk to the boss's boss. And a really good manager will respond with, fine, I'll go with you. And then you're working through the chain of command. And of course, what's going to happen is your boss's boss is just going to back up your boss. I mean, almost overwhelmingly likely. But all right, going through the chain of command is not a problem, especially if you then get back to work. Most managers, believe it or not, do want to hear what your opinion is, as long as they know it isn't going to threaten the relationship. It's not going to threaten the loyalty relationship. If they know you're going to go back to work, they don't mind hearing it. Now, the first time or the second time, it's a little bit harder, but we'll get back to that. Now, your boss's boss, again, already has a relationship with your boss. And now, of course, they're going to know you too. And you don't want that to happen in an awkward situation. Again, bringing up the classic NASA problem where this whole system broke down. And in fact, the system breaking down was an illustration of a significant organizational problem through there that was bigger than any one employee. I mean, clearly was, if you look at the history of all that. Uh, Great documentary on that, by the way, I think it was on Netflix recently, on the Challenger disaster with the O-rings and everything. Okay, now, how do you train your manager to take what you want into account when they make decisions? And for this, I'm going to appeal to something that you've probably heard about in many different contexts. It came up in a book known as The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. This is like the 8th or 9th printing, something like that. And Axelrod was studying a fundamental problem in game theory, which you've no doubt heard of, known as the prisoner's dilemma. This comes up in all kinds of contexts. I want to take this and adapt it to the employee manager relationship without making it a confrontation here. So, for a reminder of how the prisoner's dilemma works, two prisoners are captured for the same crime and they're interrogated separately. They cannot communicate with each other. The idea is if A stays silent and doesn't tell on B, and B also stays silent, doesn't tell on A, they both cooperate, they each serve a year. If A stays silent but B defects, they tell on A, then A gets 3 years and B walks, and that's symmetrical. And if they both tell on each other, they each serve 2 years. Now, the actual numbers don't matter, but the inequalities do in this. And this problem comes up all the time. Now, if you're only going to play this game once, you defect, because defecting, if you defect, then what if B stays silent? Well, you go free. That's great. Or what if B betrays you? You serve 2 years, but that's better than serving 3 if you had stayed silent. In other words, you minimize the problem for you, regardless of what A does, or B does rather. This is a so-called Nash equilibrium, believe it or not. And it means that the solution to the prisoner's dilemma with one move is trivial. No, Axelrod was studying what they call the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And he set up a computer tournament where all these programs would play each other several hundred or thousand times in a round robin and keep score on all this and figure out which strategy was the most successful in the long run. When he did this, the tournament was won by a program called Tit for Tat, believe it or not. It consisted of 4 lines of basic code. That's how old this was, and that's how it worked out. But here's the strategy. The strategy was cooperate on the first move, and then every move after that echo what the opponent did on the previous move. So if it starts off cooperating and the opponent cooperates, then the program will cooperate again. If the opponent defected, then tit for tat will defect. But then if the opponent cooperates, they'll cooperate again. It's a very easy strategy to diagnose. The opponent can figure it out very, very quickly that that's what you're doing. And this program won the whole tournament. So Axelrod released the programs to everybody, and they all analyzed them and said, "We're going to do this again in 6 months," and they did. And tit for tat won again. In fact, it's a very stable solution to this problem. So the lesson here is that cooperation can emerge naturally, even in the most hostile circumstances, as long as both sides remember you're going to do this again and again and again. See, if you're only going to do it once, then you know what to do, defect. But if you're going to do it over and over again, you'd like to develop a cooperative strategy that rewards both sides. And the tit for tat approach does that. It succeeds because it favors cooperation. That's where all the scores come. It never defects first. It retaliates immediately, but it also forgives immediately. See, if something happens that's bad, it pushes back right away, but then it lets it go. See, if we now apply this to the manager employee relationship, we still need some kind of retaliation, but it doesn't have to be symmetrical because the job's not symmetrical. It could just be a simple, subtle go into the boss's office if they have one, shut the door if they have one of those. Because again, to the outside world, we're a team, and say something like, "Look, I'm not happy. Really. I have another friend, a woman in this particular case, who works for a town in Connecticut. And she got a great idea for streamlining one of the town processes that was going to save a lot of money. So she told her boss, a guy in this particular case, and he said, "Sounds good." And he gave her the time and the budget. She went and did it, and it worked beautifully, even beyond what she expected. So she went back to him and said, "Okay, at the next town council meeting, I'd like to present this to the town so they can see how well we did on all this." And was surprised when his response was, "Oh, I already did that." He took credit for all her work, and she was surprised. And of course, her initial emotional reaction, the same one we all would have, was, "If I'm going to get taken advantage of, I'm never giving this guy a good idea again." The problem is, then the next step is, "I'm out of here," because that's the defect strategy. Both sides get into that, and it's really hard to get out. Instead, following this strategy, she slept on it. She went into his office the next day, shut the door, and said, "Look, I'm not happy." Now, I don't know about you, but if I just got praise from the town council because one of my people did something good and I said something about it, and now that person's not happy, you got my attention. I'm listening. She said, "Look, I get it. You had responsibility for this. You did give me the budget and the time to do it. But you know what? I should get something too." And if the guy has a brain in his head, and we'll come back to what happens if he doesn't, but if the guy's got a brain in his head, he's like, "Yeah, you're right. What do you want?" Was it time off? Was it a bonus? I mean, it depends on what the constraints were. In her case, what she really enjoyed was working independently. So she just wanted her pick of projects and to be left alone pretty much. And he was like, "Well, look how that worked out." Sure. And of course, the next time she succeeded, he brought her along to the town council meeting to answer questions or to meet people or what have you. You know, now that's the happy path. There are cases where it doesn't work. But the idea here is that when your boss does something you don't like, you voice your displeasure privately in a way that makes it clear this is a problem, but not a crisis. This is not, "Hey, you took advantage of me, I'm leaving." It's, "Hey, really, this isn't right. I would prefer this in the future." And then you negotiate, which may or may not get you anything. The boss may say, "Fine, I'll give you this," or it may be like, "No, I had to do it that way," whatever. And then you go back to work. That's the key because you are proving to the manager that this is not a crisis. This is not threatening the relationship. It's subtle pressure, but that pressure does build up over time. Even the manager just doesn't want to hear it anymore when they know that if they do something you don't like, you're going to be in their face. You're going to tell them, "Hey, wait, that was wrong. I don't like that." It also preserves your own sense of self-respect. You stood up for yourself. You told them you weren't happy. And this is very important. By the way, before I go on, there's a fantastic online simulator for the prisoner's dilemma problem that demonstrates this tit for tat solution along with many others. It's at this link right here, which let me paste it into the chat box here, just in case you get time to play around with it.
Ken, David's talk is going to start in 5 minutes. So
Yeah, no, I understand. I'm keeping an eye on it. Okay, the basic idea here is balance. You want balance between the relationship. The cooperation part is what I'm calling, I got this. I'm working with you. I'm doing the best I can. The retaliation I tend to refer to as a pushback. Let me say, hey, I'm not happy about this, but then you get back to work. Now, again, this is, what if your manager refuses to learn? Well, remember, this is a long-term strategy. You're trying to train them to take your interests into account. It won't always work, but it gives you something to try. And even better, you don't have to leave right away and without doing nothing when you're unhappy. It builds up evidence too that you're unhappy and you tried to deal with it. See, you never want your announcement that you're leaving to be a surprise to your manager. Because people will say, well, why didn't you say it that you were unhappy? And here you have, in a way that doesn't threaten the relationship. Surprise would mean both sides miss their chance to make it all work. And besides, some managers eventually learn. So this is a nice little strategy you can apply. And especially if you got one foot out the door anyway, what have you got to lose? Okay, the title of the whole presentation, let me finally do that, was Your Boss is Not Your Friend. Well, what do I mean by that? If you think your manager is your friend, you'll do two things that could get you in trouble. One is the first time they make a decision against you, you're going to be surprised and you're going to be hurt. I thought you were my friend. I don't know about you, but I need the emotional distance to treat the manager as a professional, not as a friend. See, they're not your friend, they're your boss. It's different. Also, if you think your boss is your friend, you'll tell them things you would only tell a friend and then rely on them to ignore those things when it comes time to give out assignments or to give out promotions or to give raises or what have you. And I don't want that to happen. I don't want them to be taking those things into account. Now, that doesn't mean don't be friendly and doesn't mean you have to say to them, you're not my friend. It just means keep the distance internally so you know that as friendly as you are, your boss is not your friend. Your boss is in a professional relationship with you. And that's an easy trap to fall into. I mean, I emphasize it because I've fallen into it so many times. By the way, your boss is not your enemy either. If it's not in your manager's best interest to see you fail. I mean, replacing people is difficult and very expensive and always makes the manager look bad. I mean, that's a serious problem. But some managers need to learn that. Okay, I had a couple special cases at the end. We've only got a couple minutes left. One was a micromanager, a person who wants to do your job as well as theirs. The good news about, or the bad news about that is you can't fix it because you're not the problem. The good news is it tends to self-correct because other managers, their peers, will be telling them you can't do both. And their boss eventually will say, hey, look, I hired you to do the management job. If you can't do that, tell me, I'll get somebody else. The flat organization, they often think it's a feature. We don't have any managers. Yeah, okay. It generally shows a low regard for managerial skills, and somebody still has to do that stuff. So it's not stable. Doesn't really scale. In a flat organization, whoever decides your future, raises, promotions, assignment, that's your manager, whether they have the title or not. That's the person to focus on. A couple of things like working remotely. Obviously, we're all living with that now. The only thing I want to say about that is that remember this tit for tat solution depends on your boss anticipating your reactions. So you need some way to have a periodic meeting. It can be a Zoom call or virtual, but video is better than voice. Voice is better than email. You just don't want to be forgotten when they're making decisions on that. And then finally, the absolute best way to tell your boss they are completely and totally wrong. I wish I knew where I found this, but I love this phrase is that turns out not to be the case. I mean, you could throw in, I could see why you might think that. Try not to roll your eyes. But that turns out not to be the case. It's beautiful. It says, I heard you, I understood you, and I applied it to our circumstance and it didn't work. It's not confrontational, and yet it gets the point across. Feel free to tell me that in evals or whatever. If you disagree with any of this stuff, I'm perfectly fine with it. So I've got some summary stuff at the end, just, basic principles here, but I'll leave it at that and say thank you very much for coming. I'll hang out here for a few minutes in case anybody has any comments or stories. Again, just as a reminder, here's my contact information in case you didn't get it. There you go. And hopefully I'll hear from you in the future. And otherwise, have a really good time in David Bernstein's talk as well. So thank you very much for coming and take care. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. I know most people are going to have to run. That's fine. Any other comments, though?
Just thank you, Ken.
Thank you. Thanks, Amir. Appreciate it. Okay, good luck. Have fun in the other talk and keep in touch.